Okay, so here we have Fabrizio Anteri'S Bant Ramp list that he posted quite recently. I know Brad Nelson's playing it tonight in what's the event called? The Fandom Legends tournament that's happening right now. The deck's a pretty sweet one. I've had a chance to play a couple of games with it tonight already. It's just a whole lot of fun, really. So you have lands. There are lands in the deck. Obviously, band color fixing. Surprising amount of basic forests, but the reason for that will become apparent as we look through the curve. There's a lot of ramp creatures, as the name might imply. You've got 4 Llanowar Elves as your turn 1 ramp, 4 your Incubation Druids, 4 Paradise Druids, 2 Druid of the Cowl should demonstrate just how ramp heavy the deck is, how mana hungry it's going to be. There's some other cards at the CMC2 slot, but they're not really CMC2, so we'll come back to those later. Jadelight Ranger in the 3 mana slot as a 2 of. Sometimes you need something to fix your draws, you just need a creature to put some pressure on the board. You have a Singleton Teferi Time Raveler. He's worse than he might be in other decks in multiples. In this deck specifically, he has some utility, bouncing, drawing a card, shutting off your opponent's instant speed interaction. 2 Prison Realms does a good job sealing planeswalkers away in boxes or problematic creatures, and the Scry is always beneficial. Shalai is a secret MVP. Not only is it a large flying threat that you can usually cast on turn 2 or 3 with the ramp creatures, the ability to put counters on creatures you control interacts well with Finale of Glory, which we'll be coming to, and also just your small ramp creatures to turn them into attackers that can pressure opposing planeswalkers, get final points of damage through. 2 Trostani Discordant turns into an army of it on its own when you cast it. Trostani Discordant also has the quite potent ability to give each player control of all creatures they own at the beginning of your end step. So this even happens if your opponent mass manipulations your Trostani Discordant. Because of that trigger, it just happens at the end of their end step, or sorry, the beginning of their end step rather than the beginning of yours, but then your Trostani will be returned to you. The card that really makes this whole deck work is NISSA, Who Shakes the World. People kind of slept on NISSA at the start of the format, but she's got 2 very powerful abilities, including her first static, and then her ultimate normally will win the game once it goes off, especially if you have either a NISSA on 9 loyalty that will persist through that, or you can -8 NISSA, have NISSA leave the battlefield, cast a new NISSA from there. So a static ability, whenever you tap a forest for mana, add an additional green. So that's why the 7 forests are in the mana base. You've got the shock lands like Temple Guard and Breeding Pool. These are forests as well. With that mana, what are we doing? Well, we have 4 copies of Hydroid Krasis, kind of the blue splash, including Teferi. It's just a very powerful X spell, leaves a large body on the board, refills your hand, gets gas back in your hand. And then 2 copies as well of Finale of Glory. It's serviceable if X isn't going to be 10 or more, but if X is 10 or more and the opponent doesn't have a sweeper, it's typically going to close the game on its own. It's a very powerful card, especially in this shell. There's also a 1-of in the 60, which is the Immortal Sun. It might seem a nombo when you've got 4 NISSA Who Shakes the World and a Teferi Time Raveler in the deck, but NISSA, really, if you're deploying the Immortal Sun, it's going to be against an opposing Planeswalkers deck. So you're talking Jeskai Planeswalkers, Esper Planeswalkers, in which case you're not going to mind so much that you can't turn your lands into creatures, but NISSA static will still be active. You'll still be getting double mana from your forests. So it doesn't punish you as badly as it punishes your opponent in those situations, and depending on the deck, especially if it's game 1, they might not be able to get out from under it at all. So it's kind of a card that says, I win the game on the spot. Spells costing 1 less to cast is beneficial, so it's kind of ramp in its own right, but that's a small bonus. The additional card helps you pull ahead, and pumping your creatures again interacts well with Finale of Glory and turning your ramp creatures into real threats if you need to close the game out. The 15-card sideboard, you have Baffling Ends for matchups like Mono Red, Mono White, where your opponent's playing small creatures. They typically can't remove Baffling End to get the dinosaur, so it's just a 2-mana removal spell in colours that don't tend to have the hardest removal. Four Negates, for decks like Grixis, for decks like the Planeswalker decks, it's just a very powerful tool to have at instant speed to interact with your opponent, especially if they're going to try and interact with NISSA, try and interact with your large plays when you're trying to resolve an Immortal Sun against Planeswalker decks post-board. 1 Forced Landing lets you bottom cards like God Eternal Kefnet. If your opponent just has flyers, you can bring it in. 2 Deputy of Detention, again, a powerful tool against more aggressive decks. You don't really want to be bringing it in situations where your opponent's likely to be able to get the creatures, permanents back out from underneath it. A second Teferi, again, for situations where it would be useful, shutting off opponents' instant speed spells. 2 Knight of Autumn, powerful against aggressive decks, mono red, mono white as well. The ability to destroy enchantments can shatter conclave tribunals, get your permanents back out from underneath those, can catch History of Benalia. Sometimes a 4/3 is going to shut down the board, sometimes you just need 4 life to stay in the game. The rest of the sideboard is another copy of Trostani Discordant. People really like playing the mass manipulation deck, either Simic or in versions of the Bant Ramp deck that are playing mass manipulation over some of the other cards, and a second Immortal Sun for the Planeswalker matchups. Like we said when we were talking about it in the main deck, if it's a card that says, I win the game on the spot, you're probably going to want more than one of them in the deck after sideboard in case the first gets countered, gets desperate, gets thought erased. You want to have it as a top deck late in the game. And even if it doesn't win the game on the spot, you're going to be able to accrue some advantage from it if it's not removed from the board immediately. And there aren't many cards that do interact with it that opponents tend to play. So that is Anteri'S Ramp. Got a game coming up in a moment that we played earlier on in the evening. It was game 1 of a best of 3. Planning to play it some more on stream over the next few weeks. So if you do want to join us there as well, there's a link to Twitch in the description below. Thank you. Okay then, waiting on our opponent to play first. What do we have? 1 land. It looks like a mulligan from me. This hand is fine. It's a bit slow, it's a bit mid-rangey. Paradise Druid's probably fine to leave on top, in the dark. Don't know what opponent's on. Hallowed Fountain. There we go. I guess we could have made the Sun Petal Grove mistake again. Interplanar Beacon. Ooh, okay. Jeskai Planeswalkers then, presumably. Paradise Druid. Might just make a Shalai next turn. Shalai is pretty good. And what are the other options? Jade Light Ranger when we have lands. I don't want to make a small Krasis. Ha! Mobilized District has little sound effects. That's fantastic. Draw some Petal Grove. We could just play some Petal Grove to save life and then jam Shalai. Does open our Paradise Druid up to getting donked by removal. But opponent can't actually really cast anything until they untap at least. So I think that's fine. Suppose we could have played Jade Light Ranger to get in 2 points of damage, but I think just having Shalai on board is pretty good. So Teferi target Shalai, Teferi dies, this is fine. It's kind of like a tempo play, but Paradise Druid still gets to go into Teferi. I still think we're going to replay Shalai this turn.
This is hardly my worst defeat.
Cool. So what would be bad for us here? You can cast Sarkhan, opponent. Ooh, wow, what is this? Tezzeret Artifice Master. That is powerful. Okay, so what are we doing this turn? We're going to attack Teferi with Shalai, presumably. What can we finale for? Finale for 4. Or we can play a Chonky Krasis. I think we're going to play a Chonky Krasis, and we're going to do that after combat. So we'll send Shalai after Tezzeret. We just want to survive. Yeah, Shalai's not really getting to this Tezzeret anytime soon, is she? Hallowed Fountain, Shock. Krasis, X's 4. I mean, if we ever draw Immortal Sun, that's kind of game. So we'll be, when we get to sideboarding, whether we win or lose, we'll be cutting our little Teferi for a second Immortal Sun as the first snap change.
I made you a gift.
You made me a gift, Tezzeret. That's kind of you. Does this trample? It sure does. Hexproof Flying Trample. 2 mobilized districts. What do they cost to activate? 3 currently. Okay. Dovin. Hand of Control. Imagine that target Shalai, because that's his only option.
I'd be less frustrated if you had fewer flaws.
Cool. Okay, so we draw a Glacial Fortress. So there's two things we can do here. There's two things we can do. I don't know which I prefer. So we can Finale of Glory, although it costs more because of Dovin. So I don't want to do that. We can just put counters on all of our things and get in. Okay, so if we're going to do that, where are we going with everything? Krasis at Dovin, Druid at Tezzeret, and then Shall I just stays back. So what did I say we were doing? Krasis at Dovin, Druid at Tezzeret. 2 attacks. Yes, 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 these are my attacks. Mobilized District becomes a 3-3. Yeah, sure, resolves. Cool.
Surprises even me.
Yeah, no, this is game 1. Tezzeret's unusual. I've seen lists that play Dovin, so he's not surprising. But this is game 1. Tezzeret's been alright, though. It's not... Maybe it's just like Azorius Planeswalkers. Because actually, we're assuming there's red in the deck. Or I'm assuming there's red in the deck. Teferi Time Raveler, sure. I mean, I don't know...
Stand by and watch.
Yep. Shall I's back in my hand. It's kind of annoying that Krasis is going to have to kill Krasis doesn't have to kill Teferi, actually. Krasis can start nugging Tezzeret. Because Tezzeret is on 8. Tezzeret is on 8. So imagine they're playing like Settle the Wreckage or something. What's the reason to be Azorius? Other than getting to play your mobilized districts. Yep. Sure. Opponent's tapped out. So that's good to know. So, Glacial Fortress. What can we do this turn? I think we just play Jade Light Ranger and Shall I, to be honest. Right? That seems pretty okay. The Immortal Sun. I think that can go on top of my library. You know? Just have a feeling that that might be pretty reasonable here. Still send Krasis after Teferi. Opponent really wants to preserve loyalty on Teferi. Go ahead, opponent. So, what's this? Oh, Khan's Bastion. I guess that's a reason to be Azorius. That's interesting. That's very interesting. And opponent draws a card. Cold Logic will always win. Tezzeret, 2019. It's probably a good sign for us when an opponent has to zero their Teferi. Tezzeret, even. Okay. What's this plane? Is it a Planeswalker? Could be any. Could be anything. Is it Cleansing Nova? Is Cleansing Nova a thing? Cleansing Nova would be bad for Immortal Sun. Does that mean they have another one for the Immortal Sun?
I've got time.
I mean, we still jam the Immortal Sun even if they have Cleansing Nova. If they have Negate, it's kind of awkward for us. It's interesting that opponent would do that. I mean, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The opponent knows about Immortal Sun. They must have a plan for it. But this is the turn to jam it. Because Finale of Glory matches up better against Teferi. We'll play land beforehand, sure. Yeah, they have a negate. Opponent... Oh, they don't have a negate. Okay. Do they just have another Cleansing Nova then? Man, playing against the Planeswalker deck with Cleansing Nova, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Kasmina resolves. Okay. Yeah, fire up District. District comes in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we can Finale of Glory for 8, which seems pretty decent. Yeah, that doesn't change anything. That doesn't change anything. Opponent can't win. Fantastic. Cool. Game 1-1.